important call right
You better take that. We'll see.
Yeah, I need to take this here. You guys keep going. I'll come back shortly.
Just pardon the interruption, folks. Jake's having an important call. We're going to let him take that. We will be here in one time. I'll know a little bit about what they do for work. That's it. Look, yeah.
God. Help him, Brayden.
What just happened, guys? What just
Dude,
happened? What just happened? Why, Isaac, why are you on the ground?
I don't know. Someone pushed
What's
him.
going on?
Someone pushed
What is
him.
going on?
I don't know.
Masked intruder came in there and pushed him.
Oh my gosh!
I'm telling you, man. It happened right in front of us all. Brayden took him out.
Well, at least the window was open, right?
Thank God. Yeah.
Who was that?
I guess. Did you guys hear glass breaking? I'm really sorry. I dropped a glass of water.
Is that me?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what that was. It was a glass of water that I dropped.
Yeah.
In case you were wondering what that noise was.
I guess so. Well, that was wild.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you're doing all right now, Isaac.
Oh, yeah, I'll make it.
All right. Are you good to continue?
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, we'll go back inside then.
Okay.
Where's the intruder?
I don't know.
He was just there.
Well, I mean, I didn't hit him very hard, so.
He must have ran.
Yeah.
Hopefully we never see him again. Now we're back inside.
Yeah.
Just a couple of minor bruises, I guess.
how are you?
Anyways.
Quite the ordeal.
Yeah.
Well, I'm doing all right, all things considered. I was a little beat up here, you know, but I'll make it.
Thank God that window was open.
Yeah, did you get who that guy was?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I guess he wanted money. Is that what it sounded like? Just from your guys' stories
I mean, no,
of when he came in?
He went after Isaac, you know. He could have got me. I was sitting in that chair. I don't know why it went. I don't know.
Yeah.
Trying to take over the podcast, maybe.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
We'll be on the hunt in case he makes an unexpected return.
Well, I really don't know exactly what happened, guys, but thank you for helping out. I appreciate it.
Did you lose your memory? You said you don't know exactly what happened or how.
Oh, do you?
What?
Wait a second.
Who am I again?
You are.
You don't remember?
You are the guy, right?
I guess you could. Yeah, I mean that's
We
a good
could definitely run for
classification.
president.
Yeah, see, I know who you are. Yeah.
Should we be concerned? Ethan?
So anyway, glad we're back here.
We should elect him, is what we should.
That was crazy, and
Yeah.
thanks again for all your help, guys. We appreciate it. So.
You sure things are good?
Only got my
Yeah, I mean, I'm just lucky to be here.
Well, list
After
off
that
the
guy.
3 people who are sitting in front of you. List off their first and last name.
Yeah, sure. Bobby Joe.
Okay, I can start.
Ignatius. Ignatius Hilmatar. And you are. Oh, my
Apparently the guy, right? Apparently
yeah,
he's the
it's
guy.
Ultrasound de Maglia.
No, totally. That's totally who we are. I think we need to get you checked out.
You might only have
Yeah.
a mild concussion. That's alright.
Well,
Yeah.
we
It'll
will
be fine.
resume this here a little bit later on. A couple weeks later, we will resume this once we get this guy checked out.
Okay, thanks, El. Well, we thank you again for tuning in. It was excellent to be joined a while ago by special guests Brayden Penniston and Draven Johnson, and that was quite the ordeal that we had. in the studio, of course, the whole break-ins. So thank you for bearing with us through that, and thank you for your continued support down the line. We may look into some sort of security system. So that stuff like that doesn't happen in the future.
You really think we need a security system?
Well, I mean, after that fella broke in here, you know.
Yeah, I guess you're the one that got pushed out the window, so, I mean, you might have something to say about that.
Well, I guess it's probably fine, you know, push out the window here and there. We don't need security.
Yeah, I guess. Definitely look into it, I guess.
Okay.
But there was this one security system who threw this guy out of his own house, so make sure that we don't get that one.
Yeah, maybe not. Okay, so what are we looking at today?
Well, do you want to describe a little bit about your recent hospital visit?
Oh, well, I'd prefer not to. It was, you know, a pretty rough time. I mean, that's just it. Yeah, you can see right here I was a bit beat up is all.
Well, I'm just glad that guy is gone forever. Not to deal with him again.
Yeah, me too.
Knock on wood.
Yeah.
So, I guess today we'll go ahead and continue the education debate. What's this little small pillow that you got here for?
Well, it's got some words in the English language. It says A+, world's best teacher. So, again, relating to the education debate, not necessarily relating to the education system, rather juxtaposing it in a sense. We know that the U.S. public education system isn't by any stretch of the imagination the world's best teacher, and statistically, it'd be closer to God grand.
Yeah, and that will be something that we'll continue to debate about today, of course, and in the future. One thing they are good at doing is making decisions on what to spend money on. Wouldn't you agree?
You know, I'd have to disagree with that.
Yeah, I was being sarcastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely some flaws in it.
Yeah, no,
I think there's good decisions that are made.
A great deal of excess spending, and of course, you know, the U.S. public education system, that's a federal system, so it's taxpayer funded, and the public schools, anywhere you go, that's the case, and it also means that in areas that are more densely populated or have better paying jobs, they're going to tend to have bigger school districts where you're going to see things like a school pool, lake, New York has 3 different football stadiums, things like that. There's a great deal of excess spending, but even in districts that don't necessarily have a great wealth of taxpayer funding, such as ours here in rural Missouri, and beyond the other end of that, some would even call it a poor school district. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it's certainly on the lower end of that, and even though we have less to work with, what they do have, there still seems to be a great deal of misallocation of the funds that they do have.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that we really touched on back in part 1, and we were certainly glad to have Brayden and Draven here during part 1 and a portion of part 2, but fortunately they were not able to make it, so we just want to go ahead and say that we wish that they could be here. And so some of the topics that they were going to have us go over, we are actually going to move to a later episode, so just keep that in mind.
So you'll have to stay tuned for that, the continuation of that discussion with Brayden Penniston and Draven Johnson. It was great having them on, so we hope to see them again soon.
Well, in the meantime, we can look briefly at one of their big topics, which was the origins of COVID, of course.
The origins of COVID, yeah. So what do we know about that?
Well, a lot of people are under the belief that COVID started in 2019, carried over to the pandemic in 2020. But if we look back at the coronavirus, it's actually been around for many generations. And so it's just important to realize that the coronavirus was around well before then.
Right, a little bit longer, at least in a certain form, because it was known to be related to another virus called SARS, right?
Yes, and that would be, and in fact, the original coronavirus, as a lot of people like to refer to it, as the one before the pandemic, It's actually been the more common type of coronavirus. Have you heard about that? More of the recent cases have actually been the old strand before it became a pandemic. Have you heard anything about that?
I hadn't. What else can you tell me about it?
Well, it has led to a few hospitalizations, but nothing as severe as what we saw during the pandemic, which is part of the reason why nobody really heard about it before the pandemic, because it wasn't as severe. There were cases of it, but it wasn't as severe as the pandemic that we had.
Right. Certainly not as severe, so that is an improvement on that front. But back to the origins of it, so what do we know about where it originally came from?
Well, of course, there's been a lot of speculation that the new strand, COVID-19, or I guess what kind of set that all in motion, that was from China. I've heard of that a lot.
Okay.
Do you think that could be possible?
Well, I'd say so.
What makes you believe that it came from China?
Well, that just seems to be the consensus about where it came from. You know, the reporting on cases seems to suggest that it started there and was somehow carried over here, so I'd be inclined to believe it.
Do we know what Draven and Brayden, what their stance on it is? Or should we wait until they come back?
Well, we'd definitely like to hear
what they have to say.
What they have to say. I think mainly what they were interested in talking about was more the response to it from a policy standpoint. So that's another thing that we'll touch on down the line. We'll start with the origins of it here and maybe get into that a little bit. So, origins from China. Do you also believe that it's from China?
I think since it's been around before the pandemic, that certainly leaves room to question if it really did start in another country.
Well, at least the strand responsible for the pandemic, do you think that one originated from China?
It's certainly possible, and we have to look at the fact that coronavirus has been around for centuries and has never really developed into a pandemic until that new strand came around. So it definitely raises a lot of questions as to why it became such a really big problem.
Sure, so the virus itself isn't exactly new. There's a new strand of it that was a bit more severe, and that's sort of why it became what was known as a pandemic, which is something I don't know that I quite understood, because before that the term that was always used was epidemic, in the sense that it was sort of a virus is widespread illness. What sets that apart from an epidemic? Do we know? Or is that sort of another word for the same thing?
Well, pandemic would usually refer to, or at least when it does happen, a much more widespread event. Now, an epidemic is already very widespread, but a pandemic is rapidly spreading over a widespread area.
Okay.
I believe is what the definition of that is. But I had not heard of that before the actual pandemic itself hit.
Right.
Because it is so incredibly rare to have a pandemic.
Right.
But we do, of course, hear of epidemics a lot, but pandemic is on a much more severe scale. It's an epidemic that's become much more severe and global.
Right, and as far as things on a similar scale, I mean, things like that aren't unheard of, and as far as I know, previously those were always known as epidemics, or of course we go very far back with things like the bubonic plague, and things like that. Now, of course, the most recent thing on par with the coronavirus would have been the Spanish flu in 1918. Do we know much about that?
Well, we know that it was also very widespread and that it had very similar effects to the coronavirus. One of the main differences is you have to think about where the world was at in 1918 versus 2020. I mean, what's our difference? 2020, things are a lot more modernized.
Right.
Life is a lot quicker. It's more busy, I guess you could say. 102 years makes a really big difference. It's a more modern lifestyle, and so the world becomes more shut down.
Sure, and I believe it goes without saying, of course, that during that time there's been some advance in medicine, so we've got a bit more to work with on that front too.
Yes, there was no real way to get a vaccine before, now there is. And that did, I would say overall, it came out pretty quickly. The vaccine did for when the COVID pandemic took place. It was less than a year, which is considerably low, that being said.
Sure.
as far as time, like considerably low amounts of time that it took for them to get that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and a number of other similarities between the coronavirus and things like the Spanish flu. Any other big consequential details tied to that?
Well, of course, we know that it spread very rapidly, but it appears that the death rates were a lot higher from the Spanish flu than what they were from
Right.
COVID.
Right, and that's the interesting thing, because you talk about a pandemic, but like, you know, it's been, at least I asked several people during that time, and even since then, well, how would you define a pandemic? And basically, they explained it wasn't really a distinct definition. It was essentially the same thing as an epidemic. So I'm not really sure why we have a new word for that. Of course, you mentioned Spanish flu. During that time, the pandemic wasn't a term that they used. It would certainly be common to refer to it as an epidemic, but this new term, I don't know, that always has bothered me, like from a linguistic standpoint, just sort of creating new words without meaning. This seems to be one of those.
I don't know that it does, because epidemics happen fairly often, where a pandemic is, I would say, extremely rare.
Right, because they just came up with the word.
It was around before the coronavirus. It's just now that the coronavirus is the only modern pandemic.
Okay.
That's been a word before the coronavirus.
Okay, well, I don't know about that. Where was it used before the coronavirus?
Well, there hadn't been anything to that scale that had happened that had needed that term of pandemic.
Okay, so it was a scientific term that existed that was never used prior to coronavirus.
I would say that it wasn't around in 1918, but it was created in the rare case if it ever did happen.
Okay, so fairly recent.
It was almost,
and that's what
the way that I think of it with the word pandemic is it hasn't ever really been used before, but it was created in case of like a situation that they didn't think would ever happen.
Huh. Interesting approach. Yeah, I've never heard it defined quite that way, and I don't think this is. I don't see as how that distinguishes it from, say, like the Spanish flu in 1918, because as you said, death tolls were higher on that, so that would seem to be major factors.
But was it on a global scale? Because the death rate can be higher, but the number of cases can be lower. Because I think the cases lower with the Spanish flu was a lot lower.
Really, I'm not sure about that. That would be interesting to find out, though. So, any other details surrounding the coronavirus that we'll have a look at?
Well, at least when it comes to the coronavirus, of course, we know that there's been a lot of debates about it, like a lot of controversy.
Right, where exactly it originated from.
Yeah, that's one
thing. Of course,
thing.
we mentioned China, one of the common theories, the Wuhan lab, that essentially one theory, of course, that biological warfare, that there's something that was whipped up by the Chinese and sent over here, and others associated with a bat, that this fellow ate a bat, and that's sort of where it originated from. What are your thoughts on those different theories? And of those different theories, are there any? Well, I'm sure there are others that I failed to mention. And what theory would you find the most compelling?
I don't know that any of them are really compelling. Probably the absolute craziest one that I've heard was that it was created as an attempt for the U.S. election to be stolen.
I've heard that.
That's probably the wildest theory that I've heard.
One.
Is that in order to keep everybody from voting, it was created a few months in advance, and to create issues when it comes to campaigning within the 2020 election. That's probably the strangest theory that I've heard. We're certainly not in support of that, in case you're wondering, and not going to provide any evidence really in favor of it, because there really is none. It's quite a strange speculation that people have come up with, so it's important to realize that.
Well, that said, if you'd like to discuss it with us, we'd love to have you on. We're always looking for new special guests if you're interested in that. place to inquire is gwp-international@att.net. That's gwp-international@att.net. If you have any other thoughts on that, you can put them in the comments down below the video.
Certainly like to hear them. So, we've had the coronavirus, of course, a few years ago. That's kind of settled down, but we've had a few other things that have been kind of popping up, like the bird flu has become an issue.
It has. So what do we know about the bird flu? Presumably based on the name, it originates from a bird of some sort.
Yes, and it's really become an issue when it comes to the egg production. Now there's becoming an egg shortage because of that, because all of these birds are having to be euthanized, and that's creating a lot of issues.
So mainly chickens then?
Yes, mainly the chickens, but also birds and just of all different sorts. And there hasn't been any human cases. That, of course, is some good news, but there was certainly an outbreak of it down in Newton County, Missouri, which is just about an hour south of here near Neosho. And so that would be more on a local scale, but there's been other reports of that in other parts of the country, and so that has led to that shortage.
Right, and we periodically cover different product recalls on this show. Now, if you've noticed the different recalls, they had a hard time finding eggs at the grocery store. That's probably why, and in sort of an effort to mitigate the possibility that the bird flu would be transferred across species and have human cases of that. We'd like to help mitigate that if possible. Of course, you don't want to be consuming eggs from birds that have the bird flu, so it's understandable. So we will continue to follow that. As far as that goes, but if there is any uncertainty about eggs in supermarkets, if it's been more difficult to find those, so that would explain a great deal of it. Have you had trouble finding eggs at the store lately, Jake?
I haven't had too much trouble, but I would say that the shelves are about half of the shelves are empty right now, and so that's pretty unusual for our local area to have such a shortage.
Right. It is.
So we've had that, and then recently in Texas, there's been a measles outbreak.
A measles outbreak, oh dear.
Yeah, and so now that's even spread into nearby states. So keep that in mind, that now we're also dealing with the measles, which there is a vaccine for that. We were talking about COVID vaccines. We also know that there is a vaccine that's been around quite a long time for the measles, and quite a few people do have that vaccine, and so that should help to slow the spread of it. But it's the largest outbreak that we've had in nearly 30 years in the U.S., the one that's going on in Texas, now Oklahoma and Arkansas and Louisiana and New Mexico. Some of those states are starting to be impacted as well. So hopefully this doesn't become on a national scale, and it is taken care of, but it seems like each day the cases seem to be doubling. Most recently, last week, there was one day where we had 48 new cases.
Right. So certainly not quite on the scale of the coronavirus. And another key difference, at least the strain of the coronavirus that we saw here recently with the pandemic, as we talked about, it wasn't previously seen, at least not on that scale. And of course, the vaccine for that was new and rolled out fairly quickly. But measles, it's been around and known for relatively longer. So had a vaccine for that for a bit longer, so it's been around for a little longer. Now, for those who don't know, what are some of the symptoms of measles?
Well, probably the one that most people know about is bumps on your skin, just a bunch of bumps that come about. So it's not really a terribly severe virus of any sorts, but we certainly don't want it to become nationwide. Right. And you did say that there were just a few cases, so it's not on the scale of the coronavirus. But it is important to realize that the coronavirus did start out as a fairly sporadic event and grew as we went through the springtime.
Right. That said, it is viral, of course, and seems to be spreading rapidly. So we'd rather that didn't continue to spread, of course, and probably the best way, if you know that you've got measles, or just avoid contact with others who might catch it.
Yes, and so make sure that you are continuing to use all of your winter precautions that you should. Of course, washing your hands and using Germ-X, and just sneezing and coughing into your elbow is always a very good courtesy of others, and staying home when you are not feeling very well. So, and of course we've had a lot of flu cases. A very severe round of flu has been going around too.
Right.
So even a few RSV cases as well, and
Yeah.
so that's pretty significant.
A lot of severe stuff, those different illnesses. Of course, you and I were still attending school, and we've seen here recently that there are a number of teachers that have been out with illness. A lot of students also, but with the teachers, there seemed to be some shortage to begin with. But now, as far as substitute teachers, they're just having a real hard time finding them to fill in with all the sickness that's going on. And many of the substitutes also wind up being sick. So
Then
there's
you
even
need
a
to-
concern there. And of course, that ties into another thing that I mentioned at the top of the episode. We'd like to get into it a little bit, is the education debate. So as far as that goes, do you remember where we left off on that?
Well, I think we had just about finished that, but the last thing that we were going over was that shortage. So, any more thoughts on the shortage?
Any more thoughts on the shortage? Sure, well, it's certainly worsened by illness, but of course, to begin with, there was a shortage, and it's reasonable to say that even COVID recently had an influence on that, but I'd say there are certainly other factors at play, and personally, both of us being part of the system, as far as the public education system goes, there seems to be a great deal of disciplinary issues, just a student handbook, a set of rules that just really are not enforced hardly at all. It seems to be often the case, and even the substitute teachers, the teachers themselves, some of them resigning, retiring, getting fed up with this, and even some of the substitutes, like folks who have been in teaching for some time, they're like, oh, well, the students have gotten so much worse, the disciplinary action, they don't do anything, that just makes it so difficult to teach anything, and they're just fed up with this. So even before all the illness, even before COVID, there seems to be an issue with that, which of course was only worsened by COVID and everything. And of course, with the lockdowns, there were many students that weren't attending school for some time, and they came back, and so that left many students that hadn't been in school for a good part of the year, and so they had less of an idea of what exactly to do, how to act and behave in school. And when they get back, that sort of contributed to making things all the worse.
Yeah, it certainly has. And so for any teachers or substitute teachers out there, hang in there. And if you're a student and you want to know how to make things better, a couple words of advice. Follow the rules. Don't stress your teacher out. Don't push their buttons. Buy them a box of chocolates. And most importantly, get them a pillow that says A+, world's best teachers.
Right.
That's the message that we're going to leave you with for
Even
today.
if you don't believe it, it's a nice gesture. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time,
I'm Jacob Fulmer.
and I'm Isaac Hedges, host of the Great World Podcast. Signing off until next time, from all of us at the Great World Podcast and GWP International, good night and God bless.